Barrett Holt didn't save people. He collected protection money, and that night, he'd just finished the job. The last warehouse owner finally signed. No threats, no hands laid. Barrett just sat across from the man in silence until the guy's own hand started shaking on the pen. 14 minutes. A new record. Barrett walked out, got in his car, tossed a cold coffee cup onto the dashboard. Goliath, 70 kilos of muscle and wrinkles, sprawled across the back seat, yawning so wide the whole car stank. Barrett drove toward the warehouse, his mind already on this week's ledger. Then Goliath barked. The dog rarely barked. He growled. He groaned. He breathed heavy like a broken pump. But barking, that meant something. Barrett hit the brakes. Goliath lunged toward the window, his muzzle slamming against the glass, eyes locked on the dark alley to the right. Barrett followed his gaze. A body lay face down on wet concrete. Rain hammered the back, pooling around the figure in dark puddles. Barrett almost drove on. He had a rule about keeping his territory clean. A corpse on his street meant cops. Cops meant trouble. But he needed to know if it was a body or a person. Goliath didn't wait. He leaped through the barely open door, 70 kilos barreling into the alley, shoving his muzzle against the figure's neck. Then he turned and looked at Barrett. The dog stared at him with a look that, in 6 years, he had never once given to anyone but his owner. Barrett killed the engine. Traitor, he muttered at the dog. Then he stepped into the alley. And that night, the coldest mafia boss in Ashford brought something back to his warehouse that he never wanted: a woman who was about to change his entire life. If you want to find out how that woman changed the coldest mafia boss in Ashford, hit like and share this story with someone you care about. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story, because sometimes one good story can turn your whole day around. Barrett dropped to one knee beside the woman. The rain was still pouring down, water running in streams along the cracked concrete gutter. Goliath lay pressed close to her, his muzzle resting on her back as though he were holding her to the earth. His eyes lifted toward Barrett, waiting. Barrett turned her over, a round face, one cheekbone bruised purple, a wound on her forehead running from the hairline down almost to the eyebrow. The fabric of her coat was torn at the side, exposing a jagged scrape over her ribs where muddy water had already leaked in. She was fat, not the soft kind of fat that people politely called full-figured. She was solidly built, with broad shoulders, large hands, thick arms. Her body lay heavy on the wet concrete, and the rain had soaked through her thick fabric coat, making her at least 10 kilos heavier. Beside her was an old leather bag, one strap torn, but she was gripping the remaining strap so tightly that her fingers had gone white. Even unconscious, she still didn't let go of that bag. Barrett placed 2 fingers against her neck. Her skin was cold from the rain, but beneath it there was a pulse. Slow, weak, but still there. He pulled his hand back, looked at the alley, looked at the dog, looked at the woman. He didn't want to take her home. Another person meant more questions. More questions meant more trouble. Barrett Holt hadn't survived 10 years in this business by bringing trouble home with him. He stood up, intending to turn back to the car. Goliath didn't move. The dog still lay beside her, his muzzle still resting on her back, his eyes fixed on Barrett with a stubbornness that, in the 6 years Barrett had raised him, Barrett had never once managed to beat. Barrett cursed under his breath. He bent down, slid both arms under the woman's back and knees, and lifted her. She was heavy, truly heavy. Barrett clenched his jaw, tightened the muscles in his back, and hauled her over his shoulder. Rain lashed against his face, water running into his collar. She hung over his shoulder like a wet sack, her hair plastered to her face, her body limp. Barrett walked out of the alley, opened the car door with one hand, and laid her across the back seat. Goliath had already jumped in first, shifting himself into the corner to make room for her. The massive hound, who had taken up the entire back seat for 6 years, had just given up his place willingly without anyone ordering him to. Barrett tossed the leather bag onto her chest, shut the car door, and got into the driver's seat. His shirt was soaked through, sweat mixing with rainwater. He drove back to the warehouse in silence, with only the sound of the windshield wipers and Goliath's heavy breathing behind him. Barrett's warehouse sat at the end of an unnamed industrial road, hidden behind 2 rows of abandoned factories. Thick concrete walls, steel doors, cameras at all 4 corners. He stopped the car in front of the gate. 2 of his men were standing guard, and when they saw the boss's car, they pulled the gate open. Barrett got out, opened the back door, and lifted the woman onto his shoulder again. This time she felt heavier because he was already tired. He walked through the gate, across the concrete yard, and in through the main entrance. 4 of his men were sitting in the large room, and they all looked up. Their eyes widened. The boss was carrying a soaked woman over his shoulder, followed by a wrinkled-faced dog. The murmuring began at once. One of the men sitting near the door stood up and asked, "Boss, who is she?" Barrett didn't turn around. He didn't stop walking. He only said, his voice as even as always, "Anyone who asks one more question can go stand outside in the rain." The room fell completely silent. No one asked anything else. Barrett carried her into the storage room in the back and laid her on the long wooden table. The table usually used for spreading out territory maps and counting money now had an unconscious woman lying on it. Barrett looked around. He searched for a first aid kit. There wasn't one. He opened a cabinet, looking for gauze. None. The only thing that came close to antiseptic was a bottle of strong liquor on the shelf. Barrett uncapped it, poured liquor onto a towel, and began wiping the wound on her forehead. His hands were used to gripping, used to punching, used to holding heavy things. But cleaning a wound, no. He pressed the towel too hard, and she grimaced in her delirium, her head tilting to one side. Barrett loosened his grip, cursed quietly, and wiped again, more gently this time. He didn't know whether he was doing it right or wrong. He only knew the wound needed to be clean, and liquor could disinfect. Under the table, Goliath had already lain down. His muzzle rested on his 2 front paws, his eyes never leaving the woman on the table. The dog was keeping watch. Not for Barrett. For her. Margot opened her eyes. A gray cement ceiling. An industrial bulb hung loose from an electrical wire, its murky yellow light glaring into her eyes. The smell of strong liquor rushed into her nose, mixed with the smell of damp concrete and machine oil. She blinked, trying to bring the room into focus. Then she felt the breath. Hot, moist, heavy with odor, blowing right beside her face. She slowly turned her head. A huge face, sagging with deep wrinkles, round wet eyes, a broad muzzle with drool glistening under the light, was staring at her from less than a handspan away. Margot screamed. She shot upright on the wooden table, and pain tore up from her right ribs, as if someone had driven a nail between the bones. Her eyes swept across the room. A man was standing beside the table, tall, broad-shouldered, his leather jacket soaked through, a towel streaked red in his hand. She didn't recognize him. She didn't recognize this room. Instinct rose before thought. Margot swung her arm and slapped Barrett straight across the face. The slap wasn't strong because she had only just regained consciousness, but it was sudden enough that Barrett had to tilt his head away. Goliath growled. The sound was low, heavy, rumbling inside the dog's chest like an engine idling in the dark. The hair along the back of his neck rose down his spine, his jaws parted, his fangs showing. Barrett didn't turn to look at the dog. He only said 2 words, his voice flat. "Goliath, back." The dog backed away, 2 steps, then stopped. He didn't leave the room. He stood in the corner, his eyes still fixed on Margot, but he no longer growled. Margot breathed hard, her back pressed against the tabletop, her eyes jumping from Barrett to the dog to the door. Panic. 3 seconds. 5 seconds. Then something changed in her eyes. As if someone had flipped a switch. The dark brown eyes that had been wide with fear suddenly narrowed, focused, sharpened. Margot no longer looked at Barrett. She looked down at her own body. Her right hand went to her right ribs, pressing gently along each bone. When she reached the 8th rib, she winced and drew a short breath through her teeth. Her left hand rose to her forehead, touched the wound, then pulled away so she could look at the red on her fingers, measuring the amount and the thickness. Then she turned her head, searching for a reflective surface. An industrial refrigerator stood in the corner, its stainless steel face dull under the light. She angled her head and looked into the blurred metal, checking her own pupils. Barrett stood beside the table, the red-stained towel still in his hand, watching her do all of it without saying a word. He had seen plenty of people wake up after being beaten. They cried, or screamed, or begged, or lay still and waited to die. He had never seen anyone wake up and examine herself, as if she were filling out a hospital form. Margot spoke, her voice pained but steady, every word clear. Right rib cracked, not broken. Forehead cut needs stitches. Around 4. Give me the leather bag. Barrett narrowed his eyes. You just passed out in an alley. You don't give orders here. Margot looked straight into his eyes. Dark brown, unblinking, unshaking. "How much longer do you want me bleeding onto your table?" Barrett looked at her for 2 more seconds. Then he turned, picked up the old battered leather bag from the chair, and tossed it onto the table beside her. Margot pulled the bag closer and opened the clasp with one hand. Inside, tools were arranged neatly in cloth compartments. A curved needle, medical thread, forceps, small scissors, a bottle of antiseptic, nearly empty. She took out the needle, threaded it, soaked it in alcohol. Then she began stitching the wound on her own forehead. Her left hand held the edges of the skin together. Her right hand drove the needle through. The first stitch went in. Margot didn't groan. Her jaw tightened. The tendons in her neck stood out, sweat rolling down her temple and mixing with rainwater that hadn't yet dried, but her hands didn't shake. Big hands, plump, short-fingered, not beautiful by any standard. But every stitch was even, precise, the space between each one as if measured with a ruler. Barrett looked at those hands. He had seen dealers' hands counting money, killers' hands assembling weapons, mechanics' hands tightening bolts. These hands were different. They were steady in the way of someone who had done this hundreds of times, on hundreds of other people, and was now doing it to herself without needing a mirror. The second stitch, the third stitch, the fourth stitch. Goliath came closer, slowly, not growling. He walked from the corner of the room to the side of the table, his muzzle sniffing lightly at the air. Then he lowered his head and smelled Margot's hand. Her hand was still holding the needle, still damp with alcohol and streaked red. The dog sniffed, his wet nose touching the back of her hand. Then he lay down, right beside the table, his belly pressed to the cold concrete floor, his muzzle resting on his 2 front paws, his eyes looking up at her. Of his own will. No one had ordered him. Barrett frowned. He looked at the dog, then at the woman cutting the suture thread with her teeth. Margot put the tools back into the bag and closed the clasp. She sat upright on the table, one hand pressed to her right ribs, her face pale, but her eyes completely awake. "I need water, a clean towel, and a place to lie down that isn't this table." Barrett folded his arms over his chest. "You think this is a hotel?" Margot looked at him, looked at the bare concrete room, the industrial bulb, the rusted refrigerator, the giant beast lying at her feet. "I think this is the only place I have tonight." She said it in a flat voice, not begging, not challenging. Just the truth. Barrett didn't answer. He stood there for a few more seconds, looking at the woman who had just stitched 4 sutures into her own forehead without making a sound, now sitting on his money-counting table and ordering him to go get water, while his dog lay at her feet as if he had belonged to her since before Barrett was even born. Barrett turned his back and walked out. He didn't say he would get water or a towel. But 5 minutes later, he came back with a bottle of water, a towel, and the key to the storage room in the back. The storage room in the back was a concrete square of about 15 square meters, windowless, with 1 ceiling bulb, 1 military folding cot with a thin mattress as hard as a plank, 1 small iron table, and 1 plastic chair. Gray walls, gray floor, gray ceiling. It looked more like an interrogation room than a bedroom. Barrett set the bottle of water and the towel on the iron table, then stood in the doorway watching Margot sit down on the edge of the cot. The springs creaked under her weight. Margot didn't complain. She looked around the room, assessing it, then placed the old leather bag on the pillow, beside her head. "Within reach," Barrett said, his voice neither inviting nor threatening, only informing her. "Things outside aren't settled yet. You stay here until I say you can leave." Then he stepped out, pulled the iron door shut, and turned the lock from the outside. The sound of metal striking metal echoed through the concrete room. Margot heard the lock, looked at the closed door, then looked down at her hands. She didn't pound on the door. She didn't scream. She lay down on the cot, pulled the thin blanket up to her chest, and closed her eyes. She had slept in worse places than this. On the first day, Barrett didn't come down to her room. He sent his second-in-command down with food, 2 cans of beans, 1 loaf of bread, 1 bottle of water. The man passed them through the cracked door without saying anything, without looking at her, then left. Margot ate 1 can of beans, drank half the bottle of water, and saved the rest for later. After the meal, she didn't lie back down. She sat up, removed the bandage from her forehead, and checked the 4 stitches. Clean, no swelling. She wrapped it again herself with gauze from the medical bag. Then she stood. Her right ribs stung when she turned, but she gritted her teeth, placed both hands on the edge of the cot, and began slowly rotating her hips. To the left, to the right, slow, controlled, exactly the rib injury recovery exercise she had taught patients hundreds of times in the emergency ward. Now she was her own patient. After 15 minutes of exercises, she sat down on the cold concrete floor, opened the medical bag, and spread everything out in front of her. Inventory. 2 rolls of gauze, 1 nearly gone, 1 bottle of antiseptic, less than 1/4 left, 3 packets of suture thread, 3 curved needles remaining, 1 surgical clamp, a little loose at the joint, 1 small pair of scissors, no antibiotics, no painkillers, nothing to fight infection except the antiseptic bottle that was almost empty. Margot arranged each item back into a neat row on the blanket, in order of use, the way she used to arrange instruments on a surgical tray. She didn't know how long she would be here, but she knew this medical bag was the only thing she had, and she wouldn't let it run out without a plan. On the second day, Barrett came down to check, not because he was worried. He needed to know what the stranger inside his warehouse was doing. He walked down the concrete stairs, turned into the rear hallway, and stopped in front of Margot's iron door. He unlocked it, pulled it open, and froze. Goliath was already inside the room. Goliath was lying at the foot of Margot's cot, belly against the floor, muzzle resting on his front paws, eyes half closed. Margot was sitting on the cot, her back against the wall, rewrapping a roll of gauze neatly. She lifted her eyes to Barrett in the doorway. She said nothing. Barrett looked at the dog, looked at her, then looked at the dog again. Goliath, out. His voice was even, clear, familiar. It was the voice that, for 6 years, the dog had always obeyed without hesitation. Goliath opened his eyes, looked at Barrett, then he closed his eyes again, took a deep breath, and adjusted his muzzle on his front paws for more comfort. He didn't move. Barrett stood in the doorway, one hand still gripping the edge of the iron door, staring at his own dog lying at the feet of a strange woman and refusing his command. Margot said nothing. She didn't ask for the dog to stay. She didn't explain. She only sat there, the roll of gauze in her hand, looking at Barrett with calm, dark brown eyes. The silence stretched. Barrett let go of the door. He stepped back outside, turned away, and walked toward the stairs. He didn't close the door. He didn't turn the lock. The iron door remained ajar, the hallway light spilling into the room, a strip of brightness lying across the concrete floor. From that night on, Margot's door was never locked again. And from that night on, Goliath no longer slept upstairs beside Barrett's bed. The dog lay outside Margot's door every night, muzzle facing the hallway, ears raised, keeping watch. Barrett lay in his upstairs bed, in silence, listening to the familiar breathing of the dog rising from downstairs, farther away each night. He stared at the ceiling. For 6 years, the dog had slept beside his bed. His heavy, steady breathing had been the only thing that filled the room. Now that breathing belonged downstairs, belonged to the unlocked door, belonged to the woman he had never invited in. Barrett closed his eyes. He couldn't sleep, but he didn't go downstairs to call the dog back. On the third day, Margot woke to the sound of footsteps. Not ordinary footsteps. Heavy, slow, deliberate. On the second floor, directly above her head, the concrete floor trembled faintly with each step. Then came the sound of a chair being dragged, metal scraping against concrete, letting out a long, sharp screech. Margot lay still on the folding cot, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Goliath lay outside her door, ears standing straight up, muzzle lifted toward the stairs. The dog had heard it before she had, but he didn't growl, didn't get up. He only lay there, ears turning with the sound, as though he had heard this many times before and knew it wasn't his affair. Then Barrett's voice carried down, not shouting, not cursing, not raised, even, slow, each word falling through the layer of concrete as if he were reading from a list, a menu, an inventory sheet. Margot couldn't make out every word. She only heard the rhythm, one sentence, then silence. The kind of silence so thick, so heavy, so drawn out that she could count her own heartbeat inside the space it left behind. Then the next sentence, the same even voice, the same slow rhythm, then silence again, longer than before. Margot sat up on the cot, one hand pressed against her right ribs. She wasn't afraid. She had worked in the emergency ward for 3 years. She had heard people scream from pain, from panic, from rage. But Barrett's voice didn't sound like any of those things. His voice was completely calm, and that calm was more frightening than any shout she had ever heard. Because a man who shouts has lost control. A man who speaks evenly, slowly, one word at a time, while the person across from him trembles so badly that everyone downstairs can feel the silence after each sentence. That man has never lost control at all. Then the chair dragged again. Footsteps. But not Barrett's footsteps. These were fast, hurried, almost running. Someone rushed down the stairs, shoes striking the concrete steps in a broken rhythm. The iron door opened. Feet ran across the yard. A car engine started, tires grinding against wet concrete, then fading into the distance. Then silence returned. Complete silence, as if nothing had happened. 5 minutes later, familiar footsteps came down the stairs. Barrett's steps. Slow, heavy, even, in no hurry. He came downstairs, walked through the hallway, and entered the kitchen area. Margot heard water being poured, a cup being set on the table, coffee being filled. Calm. As if, 5 minutes earlier, he had merely been talking about the weather, not turning a grown man into someone fleeing the warehouse in the middle of the morning. Goliath got up, wagged his tail, and followed Barrett into the kitchen. The dog rested his head on his owner's thigh, had his ears scratched, then lay down under the chair. Normal. Everything was normal. Margot stood, picked up the roll of gauze and the bottle of antiseptic, and went out to the kitchen. She needed a table to change the bandage, and her room had no mirror. Barrett sat at the dining table, a cup of black coffee in his hand, his back against the chair. He watched her come in and said nothing. Margot sat across from him, placed her supplies on the table, and began removing the bandage from her forehead. The 4 stitches were still clean, the skin around them slightly swollen but not infected. She soaked the gauze with antiseptic, wiped gently, and wrapped a fresh bandage. Through the entire process, she didn't look at Barrett. Barrett didn't look at her either. He drank his coffee, his eyes turned toward the small window above the sink, where the morning light entered in a thin strip across the floor. The silence between them stretched. Not an uncomfortable silence, just 2 people sharing the same space with nothing that needed to be said. Until Margot finished wrapping the gauze, closed the bottle of antiseptic, sat upright, and asked in a voice as ordinary as if she were asking about the weather, "Does that man have a family?" Barrett's hand stopped around the cup. The coffee cup hung halfway in the air, level with his chest. He turned his head and looked at her. Margot looked back at him. Not judging, not lecturing, not frightened, only asking. "Yes," Barrett said after a long beat. "A wife and an old mother." Margot said nothing more. She gathered the used gauze, stood, picked up her supplies, and returned to her room. Her steps were slightly uneven because her ribs still hurt when she turned. Goliath lifted his head to watch her leave, then rested his head back on Barrett's thigh. Barrett sat still. The coffee in his hand had gone cold. He took 1 sip, bitter, then set the cup down. He stood, walked out into the yard, and called his second in command to assign the morning's work. He didn't mention Margot's question. He didn't call the man he had driven away. He didn't change anything about the way he ran things. Barrett Holt was still Barrett Holt. But that question, 5 words, spoken in an ordinary voice, without blade or gun, lodged somewhere in his head, and he couldn't figure out how to pull it free. On the 4th night, Barrett sat eating alone at the kitchen table. 1 opened can of white beans, 1 fork, 1 cup of black coffee. He ate the way he ate every night, fast, mechanical, without tasting, only refueling. The ceiling bulb shone down on the wooden table, its yellowed light falling over the large, blunt hands holding the fork as he scooped up beans. Old calluses layered over new ones across the backs of his hands. Goliath lay under the table, his muzzle resting on his front paws, his eyes half closed. The warehouse was silent except for the scrape of the fork against the bottom of the can. Then came footsteps from the back hallway, slow, slightly uneven because her ribs still hurt when she turned her hips. Margot walked into the kitchen. She stood in the doorway for 1 second, looking at Barrett eating alone beneath the yellow light. Then she walked straight to the table, pulled out the chair across from him, and sat down. She didn't ask. She didn't ask permission. She sat as if that chair had been waiting for her all along. Barrett lifted his eyes, the fork stopping halfway. He looked at her, looked at the chair, then continued eating. He didn't invite her. He didn't send her away. Under the table, Goliath lifted his head, sniffed, then shifted his body over and rested his head on Margot's foot. That huge, heavy, warm head, with sagging wrinkles draping over the top of her foot. Margot didn't look down. She looked straight at Barrett. The silence stretched. Barrett ate. Margot sat. The dog lay between her legs. Then Margot spoke, her voice flat, without beginning, without leading up to it, as if she had prepared this sentence all day. "You've already investigated me, haven't you?" Barrett didn't look up. He didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He only stopped chewing for one beat, then kept chewing. That was the answer. Margot understood. "You know the events," she said, "but you don't know why." Barrett set the fork down. This time, he looked at her. He said nothing, but he looked, and that was how he told her to continue. Margot told him. She told it in a flat, even voice, like she was reading an end-of-shift report. 3 years in the emergency ward at St. Albans Hospital. Night shifts, day shifts, 16-hour shifts, without rest. She stitched, she splinted. She kept people alive when they wanted to die. 3 years, not a single death under her hands. Then one night in November, an ambulance brought in a man. No papers, no insurance, no name. A stab wound in the abdomen. Deep, heavy blood loss. The board called down and ordered him transferred. No insurance meant no money. No money meant he wasn't their patient. Margot defied the order. She shut the operating room door, and she operated. That man lived. The hospital fired her the very next morning. Blacklisted. No hospital in Ashford City would hire her anymore. Margot stopped. Her hands remained on her lap, but beneath the table, her fingers had found Goliath's head. She touched the wrinkles on the dog's forehead, her fingers moving slowly, unconsciously, as if she didn't know she was doing it. Then she continued. After she was fired, she took work at a private clinic on the east side. Low pay, long hours, but she needed the job. After 3 months, she discovered the head doctor was writing fake prescriptions and profiting from insurance. Hundreds of prescriptions never reached the patients, but the insurance money kept flowing steadily into his accounts. Margot reported him. She sent the evidence to the regulatory agency. She thought the system would handle it, but that doctor had people protecting him. Not a major gang, just a few men who specialized in hired intimidation. "They stopped me in the parking lot after the evening shift," Margot said. Her voice stayed flat, but beneath the table, her fingers tightened in the wrinkles on Goliath's head. Harder, almost gripping. The dog didn't move. He lay still, eyes closed, letting her hold on, letting her squeeze, as if he understood this was the difficult part, and his job was to stay still. "The next morning, I woke up in the alley near your warehouse." She stopped. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. The empty space between the parking lot and "woke up in the alley" weighed more than any detail she could have spoken aloud. Barrett looked at her. Then he looked down beneath the table. He looked at Margot's hand on Goliath's head. That blunt, scarred but capable hand, the hand that had stitched 4 sutures into her own forehead without a groan, was now clinging to the dog's head like it was holding on to a life raft. And his dog, his 70-kilo dog who growled at every stranger, was lying still at her feet, letting her hold on, letting her squeeze, not moving, not whining, just breathing evenly, and keeping that huge, heavy, warm head on her foot. Barrett understood one thing. The dog was doing something Barrett didn't know how to do. He was keeping her tied to the earth, with weight, with warmth, with a silent presence that asked for nothing. Margot lifted her eyes and looked at Barrett. She waited for him to say something. A comment, a word of pity, a judgment, anything men usually said when they heard a woman talk about being shoved around by life. Barrett said nothing. He stood, pushed back his chair, and walked to the stove. Margot heard water being poured into the kettle, the burner turning on, coffee filling a ceramic cup. Barrett returned to the table and placed a cup of black coffee in front of Margot, not the tin cup he always used. A white ceramic cup, the only one in the kitchen cabinet he never touched because it had a handle, and he hated cups with handles. He set it down in front of her, then sat back in his chair. No words. Margot looked at the coffee, steaming, black, bitter. She looked up at Barrett. He was drinking from his own tin cup, eyes turned somewhere else. He didn't say, "I believe you." He didn't say, "I understand." He poured her coffee in the only decent cup he owned, and that was all he knew how to do. Margot picked up the cup. Hot. She took a small sip, so bitter it made her grimace. But she drank it all. On the 6th day, the second-in-command went up to the 2nd floor to report to Barrett. The Southside men had begun probing the edge of the Eastern Territory, near the auxiliary warehouse. There hadn't been a clash yet, but they had left traces behind. Beer cans, cigarette butts, shoe prints in the mud along the fence. They wanted Barrett to know they were there. Barrett listened, nodded, ordered more men on night watch, then turned back to his desk. He wasn't worried. Southside was better at threatening than fighting, but he still sent men to check the fence around the main warehouse, just to be sure. That night, Margot was sitting on the folding cot in her room, removing the old gauze from her forehead to check the stitches, when Goliath rose from where he had been lying outside her door. The dog's ears stood straight up, his muzzle aimed toward the yard. He walked away, heavy paws moving over the concrete floor, through the rear door of the warehouse, and disappeared into the dark. Night patrol. His habit, from before Margot had arrived. Margot watched the dog vanish behind the door, then turned back to rap on fresh gauze. 15 minutes later, she heard the growl. Low, savage, carrying from the yard through the concrete walls. Goliath's growl when he was truly angry, not the warning growl from the first day when she had just woken up. This sound was heavier, deeper, trembling in the air like a diesel engine. Then came the whimper. High, sharp, broken, a sound of pain. Margot dropped the roll of gauze and sat upright. Upstairs, the bed creaked. Feet hit the floor, and Barrett rushed down the stairs, 3 steps at a time. He shoved open the rear door and ran into the yard. Margot heard his feet on the wet concrete. Fast, hard, then stopping abruptly. Then Barrett's voice. Not the slow, even voice she had heard when he dealt with his men. Not the cold, flat voice he used to give orders. This was a voice she had never heard before. Hoarse, broken. Goliath. One word. Only the dog's name. But the way he said that word made Margot get off the cot, grab her medical bag, and go out to the yard without needing to know anything else. Outside, beneath the dull yellow security lights, Barrett was kneeling on the concrete beside the steel fence. Goliath lay on his side, panting hard. His right front leg stretched out. New barbed wire, the twisted coil kind with small blades, had been wrapped along the base of the fence, in a place where it hadn't been the day before. The Southside men hadn't only been probing, they had set a trap. Goliath had lunged into the darkness when he heard movement at the fence, and his right front leg had sliced across the coil of wire. The gash was deep, nearly a handspan long, running from the elbow down close to the paw. Blood soaked the concrete, black beneath the yellow light, spreading through the rainwater still pooled on the ground. Barrett held the dog. His arms were slipped beneath Goliath's belly, pulling all 70 kilos of him onto his lap, not caring that the blood was soaking into his leather jacket, into his pants, into his hands. The dog whimpered, the whites of his eyes showing, his injured leg twitching. Barrett's hands were shaking, those hands that had sat still for 14 minutes while forcing a warehouse owner to sign protection papers without blinking. Those hands that had calmly gripped a coffee cup while one of his men fled the warehouse were now shaking because of a dog. Barrett shouted toward the rear door, his voice torn open. "Call a vet!" The second-in-command stood in the doorway, his face white beneath the light. "Middle of the night, boss. I called already. No one's picking up. The nearest animal clinic doesn't open until 8 in the morning, so..." Barrett didn't hear the rest. He held the dog tighter, and Goliath whimpered louder, his leg jerking harder. Then Margot appeared at the rear door. She stood there with the medical bag in her hand, her hair messy, her clothes wrinkled, her eyes narrowing against the security light. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't ask anyone's permission. She stepped past the second-in-command, walked straight out into the yard, and knelt beside Barrett and the dog. Her eyes swept down to Goliath's right front leg. Assessment. 2 seconds. "A laceration through muscle and skin," she said, her voice calm, professional, as if she were reading examination results to a colleague. "No tendon severed, no bone contact. I can stitch it." Barrett looked at her, eyes red, jaw tight. "You're not a veterinarian." "A laceration. Muscle and skin." It's no different from a human wound. She had already opened the bag, already taken out the needle, thread, and forceps, laying them on a clean piece of gauze spread over the concrete. "Hold his head. Don't let him bite me." Barrett looked at her for one more second. Then he shifted, wrapped both arms around Goliath's head, and pulled him against his chest. The dog whimpered, eyes panicked, leg twitching. Barrett pressed his face to the dog's head, his forehead resting against Goliath's, his face buried in the wet, sagging wrinkles between the dog's ears. He whispered. Margot couldn't make out what he was saying. She heard only the sound, low, broken, soft, completely foreign to every voice she had heard from this man during the past 6 days. That voice didn't belong to the mafia boss who controlled the port district. That voice belonged to a man holding the only thing in the world he had allowed himself to love. And that thing was lying on his lap, whimpering, bleeding, trembling. Margot didn't look at Barrett's face. She looked at the gash on Goliath's leg, and she began to work. Margot stitched the first suture. The curved needle passed through the dog's skin, pulling the medical thread after it, closing the edges of the torn flesh together. Goliath whimpered, one hind leg kicking lightly at the air. But he didn't thrash. Barrett held the dog's head pressed to his chest, both arms wrapped tight around him, his lips still moving close to the dog's ear, still whispering things no one but the dog could hear. Margot stitched the second suture, the third. Her hands moved steadily, every line of thread even, every space precise. Plump hands, short-fingered, not beautiful, but they didn't tremble by even 1 millimeter. She had stitched living people, screaming people, convulsing people, in bright emergency rooms and in pitch-dark alleys. Stitching a massive animal lying on a mafia boss's lap in the middle of a warehouse yard at midnight was only one more line added to the list. Around them, 4 of Barrett's men stood in a half-circle. No one spoke. No one helped. They stood there with their arms hanging uselessly at their sides, watching the fat woman kneeling on the wet concrete, stitching the boss's dog's leg. The 4th suture. The 5th. The 6th. Goliath's whimpers grew quieter. His breathing slowed, becoming steadier, as if he was beginning to understand that each bite of the needle hurt, but each one was also closing the wound in his leg. Barrett still held the dog's head. His face was still pressed to Goliath's forehead. His men couldn't see the boss's eyes, but they could see his shoulders. The shoulders of Barrett Holt, the man they had never seen bow his head before anyone, were shaking, lightly, almost too faint to notice. But shaking. Margot tied the final knot, cut the thread, and set the needle down on the piece of gauze on the concrete. She took a roll of bandage from her bag and wrapped it around Goliath's leg, firm but not too tight, enough to hold without blocking the blood flow. Her hands moved quickly, familiarly, as if she were bandaging the 100th case of her shift, not kneeling in a mafia warehouse yard at 2 a.m. Done. She sat back against the concrete wall behind her, tipped her head back, sweat rolling down her temple, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Her right ribs throbbed with every inhale. She had been kneeling too long, and her cracked rib, not yet healed, had taken the strain of bending forward for the entire 20 minutes. She said, tired but clear, "He'll be all right. Keep it clean. Change the bandage every day. If it gets red, swollen, or hot, call me." Barrett slowly loosened his hold on Goliath's head. The dog lay still across his lap, breathing evenly, his eyes half closed. His right front leg was wrapped in clean white bandage, neat and secure. Goliath turned his head, his muzzle pointing toward Margot. Then he licked her hand. Slow, long, soaking wet. His broad tongue dragged from her wrist all the way up to her fingers, leaving a shiny trail of drool across the back of her hand. Margot grimaced, but she didn't pull away. She let the dog lick her, then wiped her hand on her pant leg, and she almost smiled. Almost. Barrett watched it happen. His dog, licking the hand of the woman who had just stitched him back together. Barrett swallowed. His throat tightened, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning in a way he didn't allow. He turned his face away, looked into the dark yard, looked at the steel fence, looked anywhere that wasn't her and the dog. Then he spoke. Hoarse, quiet, almost unable to escape his throat. "Thank you." 2 words. The 4 men standing around them looked at one another. Their eyes widened a little, their mouths closed a little tighter. No one commented. No one dared. But all of them knew this. They had just heard something that, in all their time working for Barrett Holt, none of them had ever heard before. Those 2 words had never left the boss's mouth. Margot didn't say, "You're welcome." She didn't say anything at all. She nodded, one small nod, then braced a hand against the ground, stood up, picked up her medical bag, and turned back toward the rear door of the warehouse. Her steps were slow, heavy, her ribs hurting, but her back was straight. Goliath lifted his head from Barrett's lap and tried to push himself up. His bandaged right front leg touched the floor, and he buckled, whimpered softly, then tried to stand again. He wanted to follow her. Barrett placed a hand on the dog's back, holding him down. "Lie down." His voice was gentle, different from every order he had ever given. Goliath watched Margot disappear behind the door. Then he lay back down, set his head on Barrett's lap, his eyes still turned toward the doorway. Barrett sat on the cold concrete floor, his back against the wall, the heavy dog lying across his lap with one leg wrapped in white bandage. His men withdrew one by one, silent, returning to their guard posts. The warehouse yard emptied. Only Barrett and Goliath remained beneath the dull yellow security light. Barrett didn't stand. He didn't go upstairs. He sat there, one hand resting on the dog's back, staring at the rear door of the warehouse. The light in Margot's room was still on, spilling into the hallway through the iron door left ajar. She wasn't asleep yet. He wasn't asleep either. He sat on the cold concrete until the sky was almost dawn, the dog breathing steadily on his lap, and the light in her room finally went out. 2 days after the night Goliath was injured, Margot began to feel something was wrong. She knew it before her body said it out loud. Her right side, the place where the rib was cracked, began to ache in a different way. Not a bone ache, a hot ache, an ache that started from the inside and spread outward. The kind of ache 3 years in the emergency ward had taught her to recognize even in sleep, infection. The bottle of antiseptic in her medical bag had run dry the night she stitched Goliath. She had used the last drop on the dog, not on herself, and now her body was paying the price. Margot didn't tell Barrett. She lifted her shirt in her room and checked her ribs herself, saw that the skin around the bruise had turned red, slightly swollen, burning hot when she pressed it. Soft tissue infection, early stage. She needed antibiotics. She didn't have antibiotics. She didn't have anything except 2 nearly finished rolls of gauze and an empty leather bag. She clenched her jaw, lowered her shirt, and said nothing to anyone. That day, she still got up, still changed Goliath's bandage, still moved through the warehouse with a slightly uneven step. But by afternoon, she lay down on the cot earlier than usual. By evening, she didn't come out to the kitchen to eat. Barrett noticed. He didn't say anything, but he noticed. In the middle of the night, Barrett was lying in bed on the 2nd floor, his eyes closed, though he wasn't asleep, when the sound of scratching came at the door. Claws scraping against steel. Slow, steady, patient. Goliath. The dog was standing outside Barrett's door, his right front leg still bandaged, walking with a limp, but he had climbed all the way up the stairs to the 2nd floor. He never came up here anymore after Margot arrived. Barrett opened the door. Goliath looked at him, whimpered, then turned his head. The dog limped toward the stairs, stopped, and looked back at Barrett again. Whimpered again. Barrett understood. He didn't need the dog to explain a 3rd time. He followed him down the stairs, through the hallway, to Margot's door. The door was ajar like it was every night. The light was off. Barrett stepped inside. The sharp, heavy smell of sweat hit him. The smell of fever. He turned on the light. Margot lay curled on the folding cot, the thin blanket wrapped around her body, soaked through with sweat. Her hair was plastered to her forehead, her face flushed red, her lips dry and cracked. She was shaking. Her whole body was shaking, an uncontrollable tremor, her teeth chattering against one another. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and fast, her chest rising and falling in a rush. Barrett cursed under his breath. He placed the back of his hand against her forehead. Hot. So hot he pulled his hand back. He didn't know the exact temperature, but he knew human skin wasn't supposed to burn like that. Margot, he called her. She didn't answer. Her eyes stayed closed, her lips moving, saying something without sound. Barrett called louder. Margot. She opened her eyes. Not fully, only a narrow slit, her pupils wide, unfocused, looking at Barrett without seeing Barrett. She was somewhere very far away, inside some night shift he didn't belong to. Then she spoke. Her voice stammered, broken, so faint Barrett had to bend close to her face to hear it. Wet towel, forehead, water. Not too cold. Barrett stood. He didn't know how to bring down a fever. He knew how to force men to sign papers, knew how to run an underground empire, knew how to sit still for 14 minutes until an opponent collapsed on his own. But bringing down a fever in a woman trembling on a folding cot? No. He only had her orders. Wet towel, forehead, water, not too cold. He ran up to the kitchen, turned on the faucet, soaked a towel, wrung it out. The water wasn't too cold. She had said not too cold. He adjusted the tap a little warmer, soaked it again, wrung it again. Ran down the stairs, into the room, and placed the towel on Margot's forehead. She drew in a deep breath when the wet towel touched her skin, her eyelids fluttering, but she didn't open them. Barrett stood beside the cot, looking at the towel on her forehead. In less than 2 minutes, the towel had warmed from the heat of her body. He took it off, ran up to the kitchen, soaked it again, wrung it out, ran back down, placed it on her forehead. 2 minutes. Up again, down again. He did it over and over, up and down the concrete stairs, counting the steps in his head. 14 steps up, 14 steps down. Soak, wring, run, place, remove, run again. Halfway through, Margot started murmuring. Numbers and names Barrett didn't understand. Her voice sounded as if she was in some place very far away, a place with white fluorescent lights and monitors beeping, and the smell of medical alcohol, the place where she used to belong before the whole world pushed her into a dark alley. Barrett didn't understand what she was saying, but he heard her voice, and inside that fevered voice, he heard the rhythm of a woman used to giving orders in an emergency room. Even unconscious, she was still working. After 1 hour, Barrett remembered the bottle of strong liquor on the kitchen shelf. Alcohol could cool the skin. He wasn't sure, but he guessed. He took the bottle, poured it onto the towel, and wiped Margot's neck and forehead. The smell of liquor spread through the room, mixing with the smell of sweat. Margot shuddered when the alcohol touched her skin, but she didn't push him away. She wasn't awake enough to push. Goliath lay at the foot of the cot, his bandaged front leg resting on the edge of the blanket, his muzzle pressed close to Margot's shin, his eyes open, watching her without blinking. The dog didn't sleep. He kept watch, the same way he had kept watch on the first night when Barrett brought her home, lying beneath the wooden table and staring at her unconscious body. But on the first night, he had been guarding a stranger. Tonight, he was guarding his person. Barrett sat on the concrete floor beside the cot, his back against the wall, the wet towel in his hand. He didn't go back upstairs. He sat there, changing the towel, wiping away sweat, listening to Margot murmur in delirium, listening to Goliath breathe steadily at the foot of the cot. All night, near dawn, Margot stopped shaking. Her breathing slowed, steadier, deeper. Her skin was less hot. Sweat still soaked her, but it no longer poured in streams. Barrett placed the back of his hand on her forehead again. Warm, but no longer burning. The fever was breaking. He pulled his hand back, leaned his head against the wall, and closed his eyes. The wet towel was still in his hand. Water dripped from the edge of it onto the concrete floor, even, slow, like the ticking of a clock inside a room that had no clock. Barrett didn't sleep, but he closed his eyes, and for the first time in many years, he didn't want to be alone in this room. Margot opened her eyes. Morning light slipped through the gap of the half-open iron door, drawing one thin line across the concrete floor. Gray cement ceiling. The ceiling bulb was off. The smell of strong liquor, old sweat, damp towels. She lay still, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the spinning in her head to ease. Her body felt heavy, as if someone had poured lead into her bones. Her right ribs still ached, but the ache had changed, from last night's burning heat into a dull throb, which meant the infection was retreating. She slowly turned her head to the right. Barrett was sitting on the concrete floor beside the cot, his back against the wall, his chin slumped to his chest. His eyes were closed. He was still wearing the leather jacket from the night before, wrinkled, water stains spread across the shoulders. His right hand hung loose over his thigh, still holding the wet towel, water dripping slowly from the edge of it onto his pant leg, making a dark stain in the fabric. He had dozed off. The mafia boss who controlled Ashford's port district was sleeping, sitting up on a cold concrete floor beside a military folding cot, holding a wet towel in his hand, because he had stayed awake all night breaking the fever of a woman he had never invited in. Margot looked down toward the foot of the cot. Goliath was curled up, his bandaged front leg folded beneath his belly, his muzzle resting on his own tail, snoring softly. The dog had stayed awake all night too, and now he was catching up on sleep. Margot looked around the room. She read the traces. The plastic basin beside the bed, the water inside already cloudy, its surface faintly rippling beneath the light from the crack in the door. The bottle of strong liquor on the floor, cap open, nearly 1/3 gone. 3 wet towels hanging over the back of the plastic chair, damp, wrinkled, arranged in order from the wettest to the nearly dry. She could read everything. The basin meant he had run up and down many times, soaking the towel, wringing it out, bringing it back down, placing it on her forehead, then running up again. 3 towels meant he had rotated them, replacing one when it grew warm with another. The opened bottle of liquor, 1/3 gone, meant he had used alcohol to wipe her down. Someone had told him, or he had figured it out himself. Margot looked back at Barrett. His chin was still dropped to his chest, his breathing steady and heavy. The dark circles under his eyes were deeper than usual, clear in the morning light. She said, her voice hoarse from the fever but awake. "You used liquor to wipe my forehead." Barrett jolted. His head snapped up from his chest, his eyes opening, bloodshot, unfocused for 1 second before they sharpened again. He looked at her, blinked. "You're awake? High alcohol content brings fever down faster than water." Margot pushed herself upright, bracing a hand against the cot, wincing because of her ribs but refusing to lie back down. "Who told you?" Barrett looked at her, looked at the bottle of liquor on the floor, then looked back at her. "No one," I guessed. Margot paused for a beat. She looked at him, looked at the wet towel still in his hand, looked at the cloudy basin, looked at the 3 towels on the chair. This man knew nothing about medicine. He didn't know what normal body temperature was, didn't know how to check a pulse, didn't know how to tell infection from a cold, but he had sat here all night, listening to the stammered orders of a delirious woman, running up and down 14 stair steps, soaking towels and wringing them out, and guessing on his own that alcohol could bring down a fever. He guessed. And he guessed right. "You guessed right," Margot said. "Lucky for me." She lifted her shirt and checked her right ribs. The swelling was less red, the skin around it still warm but no longer burning the way it had yesterday. Liquor rubbed on the outside couldn't cure the infection inside, but bringing the fever down in time had helped her body focus on fighting back. She needed antibiotics, but for now, she had lived through the night. She took the last roll of gauze from the medical bag and changed the bandage on her ribs herself. Her hands trembled, her fingers not as steady as usual, but she still did it. Still wrapped it correctly, still tightened it enough, still tied the knot neatly. Barrett rose from the floor, his knee joints cracking because he had sat too long on cold concrete. He went to the kitchen and came back with a cup of water. Set it in front of her. Margot took the cup and drank. Cold water ran down her dry throat, and she drank nearly the whole cup in one breath. Then she lowered the cup and looked at Barrett standing beside the cot, red-eyed, hair disheveled, clothes wrinkled, looking like a man who hadn't slept in 3 nights, not just one. "Next time I have a fever, don't use the good liquor. Cheap liquor works too." Barrett looked at her. 1 second, 2 seconds. "I only have good liquor." Margot felt something tug at the corner of her mouth, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She almost laughed, but her right ribs tightened. The pain caught the laugh halfway out, turning it into a grimace and a sharp breath through her teeth. "Don't make me laugh," she said, one hand pressing against her ribs. "My ribs can't take it." Barrett didn't laugh. His face stayed as cold as always, but his eyes were a little less cold, only slightly, like a thin sheet of ice on the surface of water beginning to crack at the edges. He set the remaining water on the iron table, then stepped toward the door, said nothing more. His footsteps were heavy in the hallway, slower than usual, the steps of a tired man who didn't want to admit it. Margot sat on the cot, watching him disappear beyond the iron door. Then she looked down at Goliath. The dog was awake now, eyes open, head still resting on his tail, looking at her with those round, wet, sorrowful eyes. Margot said quietly, "Your owner is stubborn." Goliath yawned, a huge yawn, jaws opening wide, tongue curling, drool stretching in a string between his teeth. Then he lowered his head again, closed his eyes, and went back to snoring. Margot looked at the dog, looked at the door Barrett had just walked through, looked at the uncapped bottle of liquor on the floor. Then she lay down, pulled the blanket up to her chest, and for the first time since waking up inside this warehouse, She closed her eyes without feeling the need to keep watch. 2 days after the high fever, Margot could walk again. Her ribs still ached, but the infection had retreated. The swelling in her skin had gone down, and her body temperature had returned to normal. She was still weak, her steps still slower than usual, but she wasn't the kind of person who lay in one place waiting to get better. 3 years of night shifts in the emergency ward had carved a biological clock into her body that didn't need batteries. As dawn broke, her eyes opened. No alarm needed, no light needed, no reason needed. 5 o'clock in the morning meant the shift began. Even if that shift now only meant walking from the military folding cot to the bathroom at the end of the hall, then out to the kitchen to find water to drink. The warehouse kitchen at 5 o'clock in the morning was empty. The neon light on the ceiling flickered when she turned on the switch, spilling bluish-white light into the narrow concrete room with a stainless steel sink, a 2-burner industrial gas stove, and a refrigerator as large as a filing cabinet. Margot opened the refrigerator. In the almost 10 days she had been here, she had opened this refrigerator enough times to know its contents by heart. Canned white beans, canned red beans, instant noodles, energy drinks, 1 vacuum-sealed pack of sausages that had expired last month, and 1 nearly empty bottle of hot sauce. That was everything Barrett Holt and his men ate. But this morning, when the refrigerator door opened, Margot stopped. Inside, on the middle shelf, were things that had never been there before. A bundle of green vegetables, still wet, the curled leaves bright and fresh, a carton of 10 eggs, brown shells, clean, 2 chicken breasts in a plastic tray, with a grocery store label stuck to it, a carton of bone broth, the 1-liter paper kind, unopened. Margot looked at those things. Then she looked down at the kitchen floor. A plastic trash can sat in the corner. She opened the lid. Inside, on top, was a white plastic bag with a grocery store logo. She picked up the bag and turned it over. A receipt was stuck to the back, printed in black ink. Checkout time, well before dawn. Someone had left the warehouse before dawn, driven to the grocery store, bought vegetables, eggs, chicken, bone broth, brought them back and put them into the refrigerator, then disappeared before she woke up at 5 o'clock. Margot placed the plastic bag back into the trash can. She didn't go ask the second in command. She didn't go ask the men. She didn't go ask Barrett. She didn't need to ask. She looked back at the refrigerator, looked at the carton of bone broth. Barrett Holt, the man who ate cold canned food with a fork and called it dinner, had gotten up before her, driven through the streets of Ashford at daybreak, walked into a grocery store he had probably never stepped foot in his life, and bought bone broth. He didn't know how to cook bone broth. He had bought it for her. Margot closed the refrigerator, stood still for 1 second. Then she opened it again, took everything out, set it on the counter, and began to cook. She washed the vegetables under cold running water, her hands still trembling a little because her body hadn't fully recovered yet, but steady enough to hold a knife and slice. She cut the chicken breasts into bite-sized pieces, seasoned them with salt, pepper, and garlic powder she found in a dusty kitchen drawer. She poured the bone broth into a large pot, added the chicken, brought it to a boil, lowered the flame, and added the vegetables. She made a pot of stew, not a small pot for 2 people. The largest pot in the kitchen, the thick-bottomed industrial stainless steel kind that perhaps no one had used since the day this warehouse was built. She cooked enough for the whole warehouse. The smell began to spread. The smell of simmering broth, of chicken cooking through, of fried garlic, of fresh vegetables softening in the stew. For the first time since this warehouse had existed, the smell of real food, not canned food reheated in a microwave, drifted out of the kitchen door, slipped through the hallway, climbed the stairs, and seeped into every crack. Goliath came first. The dog limped into the kitchen, his right front leg still wrapped in bandage, his muzzle sniffing the air over and over. He walked straight to the middle of the kitchen and flopped down on the floor, right in the walkway. All 70 kilos of him, spread out like a wrinkled gray rug, blocking the path from the kitchen door to the gas stove. Margot looked at the dog blocking the way. She didn't send him off. She stepped over him, picked up the remaining piece of raw chicken on the cutting board, and tossed it down. Goliath snapped it up, chewed twice, swallowed, then lowered his head onto his front paws, closed his eyes, and kept lying there. He didn't need more. He only needed to lie here, in the middle of the kitchen, in the smell of food, beside the woman who was cooking. The men began to appear, one by one. The first man stopped at the kitchen door, sniffed, looked in, saw the pot of stew steaming on the stove, saw the fat woman standing beside the gas stove with a ladle in her hand, saw the boss's dog lying in the middle of the floor. He stood there for 1 second, then stepped inside, edged around Goliath, and sat down at the table. The second man came, the third, the second in command. No one said anything. No one asked, "Who cooked?" or "Who is it for?" Margot didn't invite them. She ladled stew into plates and set them on the table beside each seat. Whoever wanted to eat could eat. They ate, in silence. Spoons scraped plates, swallowing sounds, hot broth running down throats. No one praised it, but no one stopped until the plates were clean. One man, the largest one, with a scar running down his chin, set his empty plate on the table. He looked up at Margot standing by the stove, ladle in hand. He nodded. A small, brief nod, his mouth closed. No words. Then he stood and walked out. Barrett came into the kitchen last. He didn't sit at the table with his men. He took a plate, served himself, then went to the farthest corner of the table and sat alone. His back turned to the whole room. He ate. Didn't look at anyone. Didn't say anything. Margot didn't look at him. She washed the pot, washed the ladle, stacked dirty plates in the sink. But out of the corner of her eye, she saw Barrett set his plate down, clean, completely empty. For the first time in this warehouse, he had finished an entire plate of food. He stood, placed his plate in the sink, and walked out without turning back. Margot washed his plate along with everyone else's. No one told her to wash them. No one thanked her. But that night, before going into her room, Margot opened the refrigerator to check. There was enough food left for tomorrow. The next morning, when she woke at dawn and opened the refrigerator, there was fresh food inside again. Vegetables, eggs, meat, a grocery store plastic bag, the receipt printed while the city was still dark. The morning after that, the same. And the morning after that. The receipts were always printed before the first light of day. Margot never asked who bought the food. Barrett never said he had bought it. And just like that, every morning, the refrigerator was full, the kitchen was warm, the pot of stew steamed, the men sat down at the table, Goliath lay blocking the kitchen, and Barrett ate alone in the farthest corner, his back turned to everyone, his plate always cleaned empty. 1 week after the night Margot cooked the first stew, the warehouse had found a new rhythm. Every morning, the refrigerator was full of fresh food. Every noon, steam rose from the kitchen. Every evening, Barrett's men sat down at the table without anyone needing to call them. Margot wasn't Barrett's person. She wasn't one of his men, wasn't an ally, wasn't anyone at all inside the power structure of this warehouse. But she was the one who cooked. And in a world where men had eaten canned food for 3 straight months, the person who cooked held a place no one needed to say out loud. That night, Margot was washing dishes after dinner when the sound of a car outside the gate broke the usual rhythm. It wasn't the sound of a car parking normally. It was the sound of tires grinding against concrete, brakes screeching, car doors being thrown open, shouting. Margot turned off the faucet, listened. The sound of several people running across the yard, heavy shoes pounding concrete, one man groaning over and over, long, broken sounds. Then the warehouse's front door burst open, and 2 of Barrett's men rushed in. Between them was a third man, his left arm slung over the shoulder of the man on his right, his feet dragging across the floor. His right shoulder was soaked, his shirt dark from his neck down to his elbow, his face gray under the neon lights. He was losing blood. A lot of it. Chaos. The 2 men carrying him lowered the injured man onto the concrete floor in the middle of the main room. He lay on his back, groaning, his left hand clawing at his right shoulder, his eyes rolling white, his legs kicking against the floor. The men around him shouted, one calling someone, one running for towels, one standing there with a bloodless face, just staring. Goliath rushed out of the kitchen. The furious gray mastiff barreled into the middle of the crowd, the hair along his spine raised, growling. The growl was low, vicious, shaking the floor. He growled at the panicking men, his instinct guarding the territory against the disorder, and the thick metallic smell flooding the room. Barrett came down the stairs, 3 steps at a time. His eyes swept across the room in 1 second, reading the situation. One of his men was badly wounded in the shoulder, losing a lot of blood, needed treatment now. Goliath. Down. Barrett's voice cut through the growl. The dog lay down, belly pressed to the floor, but he still growled softly deep in his throat, his eyes sweeping over the panicked men. Barrett pulled out his phone and called the underground doctor. The line rang. Rang. No answer. He called again. It rang. No answer. His second in command stood beside him, his face tense. "Boss, if we can't stop the bleeding within..." Barrett didn't need to hear the rest. He knew. Then Margot stepped out from the kitchen doorway. She crossed the main room, walking straight, not hurried, not slow. She stepped over Goliath. The dog lay on the floor, still growling softly at the men around him. But when Margot stepped over him, the growl stopped. He watched her pass in silence, then turned back and growled at everyone else. The men standing around saw it. The dog growled at them, not at her. Margot reached the injured man, knelt down, and swept her eyes over his right shoulder. 2 seconds. She stood and turned to Barrett. "He's lost a lot of blood. Shoulder wound, deep but not touching bone. I can handle it." She paused for a beat. "If you allow it." Barrett looked at her, looked at the man on the floor, whose face was growing paler, whose grip on his shoulder was weakening by the second. Looked back at Margot. Decision. Cold. Fast. Like every decision he had made in 10 years of ruling Ashford's Port District. "You have 30 minutes. Tell me what you need." Then he turned to his men, his voice even, clear, sharp as a blade. "Light. Bring the desk lamp over here. Hot water, 1 basin. No one enters this room. No one leaves. Anyone on the phone, hang up." The room went silent. Orders. The men moved, fast, exact, without asking twice. The desk lamp was pulled close, white light falling over the injured man's shoulder. A steaming basin of hot water was set nearby. Margot opened her medical bag. She knew the bag was almost empty. 2 curved needles left. 1 packet of suture thread. 1 clamp. No anesthetic, no antibiotics. Nothing except her hands and 3 years of emergency ward experience. She washed her hands in the hot water basin, sterilized them with the strong liquor. Barrett ordered one of his men to bring down. Then she began. She cut open the injured man's shirt at the shoulder, exposing the wound. Deep, torn muscle. The skin edges folded back, but the main artery wasn't severed. Without looking up, she said to Barrett, "I need someone to hold his shoulder. Hold him tight. He's going to thrash." Barrett stepped forward from the corner of the room. No words. Both of his hands came down on the injured man's left shoulder and chest, pressing him into the floor. Barrett Holt's pressure. Steady, strong, absolute. The injured man couldn't move even if he wanted to. Margot worked. She clamped, wiped, found the main bleeding point, pressed, held. The injured man groaned through clenched teeth, his legs kicking against the floor. But his shoulder stayed pinned under Barrett's hands and didn't shift. Margot stitched. The first suture. The second. Her hands moved through the red without trembling, without hesitation, without a single wasted motion. Unpolished, heavy hands, but every pass of the needle went exactly where it needed to go. Every pull of the thread had exactly the strength it needed. Every knot was tied exactly the way it had to be tied. Barrett stood holding the patient down, but his eyes were on Margot's hands. He had watched those hands stitch her own forehead on the first night. He had watched them stitch Goliath's leg under the security lights. But this time was different. This time, those hands were holding a human life. One of his people. And they were holding it well. 15 minutes. Margot tied the final knot, cut the thread, and set the needle down. She wiped the wound clean, wrapped bandage around the shoulder, tight enough to hold but not tight enough to cut off circulation. The injured man breathed hard, his eyes glassy, but his skin was less pale, alive. Margot sat back against the wall behind her, her legs stretched out on the floor, both hands resting on her thighs. Sweat ran down her temples, sticking her hair to her neck. Her hands were red from wrist to elbow. Clothes wrinkled, face exhausted, but her eyes were calm. Calm as if she had just finished a normal case during a normal shift on a normal night in a normal hospital, not stitched a mafia soldier's shoulder on the concrete floor of a warehouse, with a nearly empty medical bag under the light of a desk lamp. Barrett straightened, took his hands off the injured man's shoulder, and stepped back. He looked at Margot. She was sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, hair messy, hands dirty, clothes rumpled, tired. He looked at her with eyes the men standing around him had never seen the boss use on anyone. Not the look he gave a stranger staying under his roof. Not the look he gave the woman who cooked. It was the look of a man who had just realized what he couldn't lose, and for the first time understood that it wasn't territory, wasn't money, wasn't power, but a woman sitting on a concrete floor with blood on her hands and calm in her eyes. After the night Margot saved one of his men, the warehouse changed in a way no one said out loud, but everyone felt. The injured man recovered in the East Room, and Margot changed his bandage every day, checked the stitches, measured his temperature with the back of her hand because there was no thermometer. Barrett's men no longer looked at her in the hallway with the suspicious eyes they had used during the first week. They moved aside to let her pass, gave her small nods, the kind of nods they only gave the second in command, or Barrett himself. The fat woman in the kitchen was now the fat woman who had held a life in place with an empty medical bag and 2 bare hands. No one said it, but no one forgot it. Then the situation outside eased. The Southside gang pulled back south after losing 2 transfer points on the edge of the port. The road opened. The warehouse gate no longer needed double guards. Cars came and went normally. Ashford City returned to its usual gray rhythm, and the only reason Margot had to remain in the warehouse disappeared, along with the lockdown order. That morning, Margot woke at dawn as usual, went to the kitchen, and opened the refrigerator. Fresh food was still there, the receipt printed with a time from earlier in the dark. She took out the vegetables and began washing them, preparing breakfast. Then Barrett walked into the kitchen. Earlier than usual. He usually didn't come down to the kitchen before 7 o'clock. Today, he arrived while she was standing beside the sink, holding a bundle of greens under the running water. He didn't pour coffee. He didn't sit in his usual corner of the table. He walked straight to the dining table and placed a thick brown envelope on it. No stamp, no name written on it. Then he stopped there, arms folded across his chest, looking at Margot. Margot turned off the faucet, looked at the envelope, looked at Barrett. She wiped her hands on a towel and stepped to the table, but she didn't sit. She stood across from him, the envelope lying between them. A clinic in Sterling City, 4 hours' drive from here, Barrett said. His voice was even, calm, the voice of a man who had prepared this sentence in advance. They're hiring a nurse, decent pay, safe neighborhood. No one there knows your past. Margot looked at the envelope, didn't open it. What's inside? Cash. Enough for you to rent a room for 2 months while you wait for your first paycheck, the clinic's address, and a letter of recommendation from a doctor. Margot lifted her eyes. Her eyes narrowed. Those dark brown eyes Barrett had grown used to seeing over nearly 2 weeks. But now there was something different inside them. Not anger. Not yet. Where did you get a letter of recommendation from a doctor? Barrett didn't avoid the question. He looked straight at her, his voice unchanged. I know you graduated with honors in nursing from St. Albans. 3 years in the emergency ward. Not a single death under your hands. Fired for disobeying a direct order from the board. Then 3 months at Eastwell Private Clinic. Let go because you reported insurance fraud. Margot stood still. Every word Barrett had just said fell into the space between them like pebbles dropped into a deep well. He knew. He knew everything. Not because she had told him. He had known before she ever opened her mouth on the 4th night at the dinner table. You investigated me. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Barrett didn't deny it. I investigate everyone who steps into my territory. Silence. Margot looked at the envelope on the table. Cash. A new address. A letter of recommendation. A new life, wrapped inside a brown envelope, arranged ahead of time by a mafia boss she had never asked. She reached out, placed her hand on the envelope. Then she pushed it back toward Barrett. Slowly, firmly, the envelope slid across the wooden tabletop and stopped in front of his hand. You think money and an address are enough? Margot's voice wasn't angry. Barrett had seen her angry, that first night when she slapped him on the wooden table, and her anger sounded different. Her voice now was sad. Sad in the way of someone too familiar with other people deciding her life for her. You think arranging someone else's life and sending them away is protection? Barrett tightened his jaw. I'm giving you the best chance you're going to get. Margot looked at him, looked straight, didn't blink. You're giving yourself an excuse so you don't have to change. That landed. Barrett didn't grimace, didn't step back, didn't react on the outside. But Margot saw it. She had read patients' bodies for 3 years, read widening pupils, read the pulse beating in the neck, read the tightening of a jaw when people swallowed pain they didn't want anyone to know about. She saw Barrett's jaw tighten by 0.5 millimeter. She saw his arms folded across his chest, press harder, his fingers digging into his biceps. She had hit the mark, and he knew she had. In the corner of the room, Goliath lifted his head. The dog had been lying there since early morning, his muzzle resting on his front paws, his eyes half closed, lazy. But now he stood, slowly. His right front leg was still slightly lame, though the stitches had almost completely healed. He crossed the kitchen, claws clicking against the concrete floor, walked past Barrett, and came to where Margot stood. Then he lay down, right beside her feet, belly pressed to the floor, muzzle resting on her foot, eyes closing. Barrett looked at the dog. His jaw tightened so hard the muscle at his temple stood out beneath the skin. His dog. 6 years, 70 kilos. The only thing he had allowed himself to be close to. He had just stood, walked past him, and lain down beside her, in front of him. Barrett said nothing more. He lowered his arms from his chest, turned his back, and walked out of the kitchen doorway. His footsteps were heavy on the concrete, steady, unhurried, but every step carried him a little farther from Margot. He walked into the yard, through the gate, and disappeared into the gray light of an Ashford morning. In the kitchen, Margot stood beside the table. The brown envelope lay on the tabletop, untouched, unopened, put away by no one. Goliath breathed evenly at her feet. The bundle of greens still sat wet in the sink, the faucet dripping. Margot looked at the envelope. Then she turned back to the sink, turned on the water, and continued washing the vegetables. She didn't put the envelope away. She didn't open it either. She left it there, on the table, in the middle of the kitchen, for Barrett to see every time he walked in. Barrett stayed out all day. He didn't come back to the warehouse for lunch the way he usually did. He drove to the port, sat in his car watching cargo ships dock, drank cold coffee from a paper cup, smoked half a cigarette, then threw it away. He didn't smoke often, only when his head was tangled enough that his hand needed to hold something besides a coffee cup. Margot's sentence stayed in his mind all day, turning over and over like a washing machine stuck on the same cycle. You're giving yourself an excuse so you don't have to change. He hated that sentence. He hated it because it was true. He had woken at 4:30 in the morning, driven to the grocery store to buy greens and chicken like he did every day, then stopped by a familiar place to pick up the envelope he had prepared 3 days earlier. Money, address, recommendation letter. He had arranged everything perfectly. A new life for her, wrapped up, clean, safe. And in his head, that was the only way of caring he knew. Handle everything, then push her away so she wouldn't have to spend one more day in his world. But she had pushed the envelope back, and his dog had lain down beside her feet. Late afternoon, Barrett drove back to the warehouse. He sat in the car in the yard for 10 minutes, looking at the front door, looking at the kitchen light spilling through the small window. The smell of stew drifted through the cracked car window. She was still cooking. She was cooking dinner for his men, in his warehouse, with the food he had bought, while his envelope lay untouched on the table. He turned off the engine and stepped inside. The kitchen was empty. His men had finished eating. Plates were in the sink. The table had been wiped clean. Only Margot remained, sitting at the dining table, her chair pulled out at a slight angle, her arms folded across her chest, her back straight. The brown envelope still lay on the tabletop, exactly where it had been, not moved by even 1 millimeter. Goliath lay beside her chair, his muzzle resting on her foot, his eyes half closed. She was waiting for him. Barrett stepped into the kitchen and stopped at the door. He looked at her, looked at the envelope, looked at the dog. He drew in a breath, about to speak. Margot cut him off before the first sound could leave his mouth. Last week, when you had your second-in-command take me to buy more medical supplies, I stopped in the South District. Barrett closed his mouth. His hands dropped to his sides, his shoulders stiffening slightly. But he didn't interrupt her. He listened. Margot told him. Her voice was neither fast nor slow, even, clear. Each detail laid out in front of Barrett the way she arranged instruments on a surgical tray. A factory worker at the end of the street, his finger cut by a stamping machine, wrapped in an old sleeve, the wound left untreated for 2 days, already starting to swell with pus. Margot cleaned it, disinfected it, stitched 3 sutures, and bandaged it properly. An old woman in a second-floor apartment above a pawn shop, chronic back pain, no money for medicine, no insurance, lying in bed for 3 weeks with no one caring. Margot examined her, taught her mobility exercises, and gave her the last 2 painkillers in her bag. A drunk man on the street corner, shoulder dislocated, sitting and groaning by the curb while people stepped around him. Margot set the joint back in place, and the man screamed once, then went silent, able to move his arm again, looking at her as if he had just seen a miracle. 3 days, 6 people. A man with a burned hand from a diner, a mother with a lingering sore throat and no money for a clinic, a loader with a crushed toe. Margot treated all of them. Free, with the last things in the old battered leather bag whose strap she had clutched tight from the night she lay unconscious in the alley. 6 people, Margot said. In 1 week, with an almost empty bag, Barrett stood in the kitchen doorway, silent. His face didn't change, but his jaw wasn't clenched. For the first time, Margot saw his jaw not tighten when he heard unexpected news. He only stood there, listening, his eyes on her, no reaction. Then he said, his voice low, "You went down to the South District? My second-in-command let you." "Ask him," Margot said. "He couldn't stop me, and he didn't want to stop me either." Barrett went quiet. Margot looked at him, and she knew. He had already known. His second-in-command had reported back. Surely, because his second-in-command reported everything, and Barrett had heard it, had known it, had chosen to say nothing. He had let her go. He had let her treat people in his territory. He had let it happen, then pretended not to know, because if he admitted he knew, then he would have to decide, forbid it or allow it. And he didn't want to forbid it. Margot bent down, picked up the leather bag from under the chair, set it on the table, and opened it. Inside was almost nothing. 1 last roll of gauze, half used, the surgical clamp loose at the joint, no suture needles left, no antiseptic left, nothing left. "I'm out of supplies," Margot said. "I need a source." "You have sources." She looked straight at him. "The South District, the territory you control, doesn't have a clinic, doesn't have a doctor, doesn't have a nurse. It only has liquor stores and pawn shops." Barrett looked at her. "That district is dangerous. Sounds like a place that needs someone to heal people." Silence. In the middle of the warehouse kitchen, beneath the bluish-white neon light, the two of them stood facing each other. The brown envelope lying between them on the table, the empty leather bag open beside it. Goliath yawned. A huge yawn, jaws opening wide, tongue curling, the sound echoing through the silent kitchen. Calm. Completely calm. At the moment when the tension between them was at its tightest, the huge mastiff lying at Margot's feet yawned as if he were watching a movie whose ending he had known for a long time. Margot looked down at Goliath. Then she looked up at Barrett. 7, she said, "counting your dog." Barrett looked at her, looked at the empty bag, looked at the envelope he had prepared 3 days earlier, a new life wrapped in brown paper, lying untouched on the table, looked at the dog yawning at her feet. The silence stretched, so long that the faucet dripping in the sink sounded as clear as someone knocking at the door. Then Barrett opened his mouth. His voice was no longer cold, no longer flat, no longer even, only tired. Tired in the way of someone who had been bracing himself his whole life and had just realized he didn't have to brace anymore. "What do you need?" Rumors in the South District spread faster than any other kind of news in Ashford City, faster than news about territory, faster than news about cargo, faster even than news about who had just lost their place inside the Port District's power structure, because rumors about territory only mattered to men who sold their lives for money. But rumors about someone who could heal people for free mattered to everyone. The factory worker with the cut finger told his wife told the neighbor told the woman who ran the small grocery at the mouth of the alley, the old woman with back pain told the milk delivery man told the owner of the beer joint on the corner, the drunk with the dislocated shoulder told anyone willing to listen, and a drunk man would tell the whole world. Within 1 week, the whole South District knew. There was a fat nurse living in Barrett Holt's warehouse. She treated people without taking money. Her hands were as skilled as a hospital doctor's, and Barrett's dog followed her like a shadow. The rumor flowed along the streets, through beer joints, through pawn shops, through parking lots, through factories, and at last it reached the ears of the people Margot didn't want it to reach. The next morning, the second-in-command went up to the second floor and knocked on Barrett's door. His face was usually expressionless, but that morning, he knocked 1 beat faster than usual. Barrett opened the door with a coffee cup in his hand. The second-in-command kept it brief. The men watching the South District had reported back. 2 strangers had been asking people on the lower street about the nurse at the boss's warehouse. asking what her name was, how long she had been there, whether she worked for Barrett. Not police, not reporters. The kind of questions asked by people looking for one specific person to solve one specific problem. Barrett set the coffee cup on the table. He didn't ask what his second-in-command thought. He asked for facts. The doctor from Eastwell Private Clinic. Full name. The second-in-command gave the name. Barrett nodded. Current address. The second-in-command gave the address. Barrett nodded. How many men protecting him? 3, sometimes 4. Hired by the job, not tied to any major gang. Who pays them? The doctor himself. He has money from the insurance fraud. He hasn't been prosecuted, because no one came forward to testify after Margot disappeared. Barrett listened to all of it, without his face changing. He processed the information, the way he calculated the weekly accounting sheet. Name, address, numbers, money source, danger level. No emotion, no anger, not one expression slipping through the mask he had worn for 10 years. But the second-in-command, who had stood beside Barrett long enough to read the things other people couldn't read, saw one small detail. When he spoke the doctor's name, Barrett's finger pressed harder into the tabletop, only slightly, but enough to leave a dent in the soft wood. The second-in-command didn't comment. Barrett stood. He pulled the leather jacket from the back of the chair, put it on, and zipped it up. The jacket was old, the leather worn at the elbows and shoulders, but it was heavy, thick, and familiar on his body, like a second layer of armor. He stepped to the door of the room and looked down the stairs. Call me 3 men. Men who know how to keep quiet. The second-in-command nodded, pulled out his phone, and walked away. Barrett went down the stairs. His footsteps on the concrete steps were even, heavy, the rhythm of a man going to do work he had done his whole life. Not the first time, not the last. He crossed the hallway, passed through the large room, and stopped at the kitchen doorway. Margot was standing beside the gas stove, preparing breakfast. She heard his footsteps and turned. She saw the leather jacket. She saw the face. She saw the gray eyes, no colder than usual, no hotter than usual. Only calm in the way she had learned meant Barrett was at his most dangerous. Not when he was angry. When he was calm. Lock the door, Barrett said. Don't open it for anyone except my second-in-command. Margot set the ladle down on the stove. What are you going to do? Barrett didn't answer. He looked at Goliath. The dog stood beside the dining table, ears raised, eyes on Barrett, tail lowered. He could read it. The dog had lived with him for 6 years. He knew when his owner was going out to buy coffee, and when his owner was going out to do something else. Stay, Barrett told the dog. 2 words. His voice was low, clear, not a military order. It was the voice of a man leaving the most precious thing he had with the person he trusted to keep it safe. Goliath looked at Barrett. Then he looked at Margot. Then he walked to Margot's side and lay down, belly pressed to the floor, muzzle resting on his front paws. He stayed. Barrett looked at the dog lying beside her. He didn't nod, didn't say anything else, didn't promise he would come back. He only looked for 1 second, then turned away. He walked out of the kitchen doorway, crossed the large room, where 3 of his men were already waiting by the front door, wearing jackets, silent. Barrett passed them, went into the yard, and got into the car. The 3 men got into the car behind him. Doors closed. The engine started. The car rolled out through the gate. In the kitchen, Margot stood beside the gas stove, listening to the car fade into the distance until there was only the drip of the faucet and the steady sound of Goliath breathing at her feet. She looked down at the dog. The dog looked up at her. Barrett had left Goliath with her. He hadn't said, "I'll come back." He hadn't said, "Don't worry." He had left the dog. And Margot understood. That man would come back, because the only thing in the world he would never abandon was lying at her feet. Margot bent down, placed her hand on Goliath's head, and touched the familiar wrinkles between his ears. The dog closed his eyes. Margot turned back to the gas stove, lowered the flame, and continued cooking breakfast. She made enough for Barrett. His portion, she set aside on the stove, covered, keeping it warm. She didn't know how long he would be gone, but she knew that when he came back, he would be hungry. And she knew one more thing, clear and cold the way she read lab results. When Barrett Holt returned, no one would look for her again. Margot didn't sleep. She didn't try. She knew she wouldn't be able to sleep until she heard the car outside the gate, so she didn't waste time lying on the folding cot, staring at the concrete ceiling and pretending to close her eyes. Instead, she worked. After Barrett left, she washed the dinner dishes, wiped down the stove, swept the kitchen floor. She checked the stitches on the injured man's shoulder, changed the bandage, and laid fresh gauze over it. He was asleep, breathing evenly. His color had come back, and the fever was mild but not dangerous. She made ginger tea from a few pieces of ginger she found in the kitchen drawer, drank 1 cup, then set the kettle back on the stove to keep warm. Then she sat at the kitchen table, opened the medical bag, and began to prepare. She spread everything that was left across the wooden tabletop. The last roll of gauze, she tore into 3 usable pieces. The bottle of antiseptic. She shook it. There was enough for exactly 2 uses, and she saved both. The surgical clamp, loose at the joint but still able to grip. The small scissors. Then she stood, took a bowl from the kitchen shelf, poured warm water from the kettle into it, and set it beside the tools on the table. She arranged everything in order. The bowl of warm water in the left corner, the antiseptic beside the bowl, the gauze in the middle, the clamp and scissors on the right. Ready. The men had all gone to sleep. The warehouse was silent, with only the drip of water in the sink and the steady hum of the generator in the back. Margot sat at the table, arms folded across her chest, looking toward the warehouse's front door through the small window above the sink. Outside, the Ashford night was thick and black, moonless, the pale yellow streetlight casting itself against the concrete wall across the way. Goliath lay beside the table, pressed close to Margot's leg. The dog didn't sleep. His ears were raised, his eyes open, his muzzle resting on his front paws. But each time there was a sound outside, even just a stray cat or an empty beer can rolling across the sidewalk. His ears turned, his nose breathed in, his eyes swept toward the noise. He kept watch. He waited, just like her. They were both waiting for the same man. Time passed. Margot didn't look at the clock. She sat at the table, sometimes taking a sip of ginger tea, sometimes reaching down to touch Goliath's head, her fingers tracing the familiar wrinkles between the dog's ears. She thought about what Barrett might be doing. She didn't know the details. She didn't need to know the details. She only knew that the man had put on his leather jacket, called 3 men, driven into the night, and before leaving, he had given her the dog. He had given her Goliath. The only thing, and she knew, by the instinct of someone who had spent 3 years reading other people's bodies, that Barrett would come back. But she also knew, through the experience of someone who had lived long enough in this world, that when he came back, he wouldn't come back whole. So she prepared. Near dawn, when the sky beyond the small window began turning from black to gray at the edge of the horizon, Goliath lifted his head, ears up, nose breathing in. His tail began tapping lightly against the concrete floor. He heard it before Margot did. 10 seconds later, Margot heard the car. The familiar engine, Barrett's car, turning onto the industrial road at the end of the street. The engine slowing, tires over concrete, the iron gate opening, metal dragging along the track with a sharp screech, the car entering the yard, the engine shutting off, a car door opening, then footsteps, heavy, slow, but steady. He could walk. He was on his feet. Margot breathed out. She hadn't realized she had been holding her breath. The warehouse's front door opened. Barrett stepped in. The neon light in the large room fell over him. His leather jacket was torn at the right shoulder, a rip about a handspan long, exposing the fabric lining underneath. His right hand was bruised from the knuckles to the wrist, the skin swollen and darkened under the light. But his face was calm. Barrett Holt's face was always calm, whether he had just spent 14 minutes forcing a man to sign papers, or had just spent all night doing something he would never describe in detail. He crossed the large room, turned into the kitchen, and stopped in the doorway. He looked at the dining table, the torn gauze, the bottle of antiseptic, the clamp, the scissors, the bowl of warm water. The tools arranged in order on the wooden tabletop, neat, ready. Then he looked at Margot. She was sitting in the chair, arms folded across her chest, back straight, eyes on him. She didn't ask, "Are you okay?" She didn't run to him. There was no worry on her face. She sat there, calm, beside the table where she had laid out medical tools hours earlier, and she looked at him with the eyes of someone who had known he would come back like this. Goliath rushed toward Barrett. 70 kilos of slate-gray fur barreled through the kitchen, tail wagging wildly, muzzle pressing into Barrett's thigh, a happy whine rising in his throat. Barrett bent down, his left hand scratching the dog's head, his fingers sinking into the wrinkles between Goliath's ears. His right hand stayed still at his side, unmoving. Bruised, Goliath licked Barrett's left hand, tail wagging, muzzle rubbing against him, the dog's whole body trembling with joy. His owner had come home. Margot said 2 words, her voice even, neither loud nor soft. "Sit down." Barrett lifted his head from the dog and looked at her. She looked back. It wasn't a look asking permission. It wasn't a suggestion. It was the look of someone giving an order, the right way, at the right time, in the right place, the way she had given orders on the blood-stained wooden table the first night. But that time, she had given orders when she was weak. This time, she gave orders when he was weak. Barrett sat down, didn't argue, didn't ask. He sat, placed his bruised right hand on the table beside the bowl of warm water, and let her work. Margot pulled her chair closer, sat across from him, and took his right hand in both of hers. She turned his hand under the light and checked it. The bruising spread from his knuckles to his wrist, the skin swollen but not split, no broken bones. She dipped gauze into the bowl of warm water, wrung it out, and began wiping gently over the bruises. When the warm water touched the swollen skin, Barrett drew a short breath through his nose, but he didn't pull his hand away. Silence. The sound of wet gauze moving over skin. The sound of water dripping from the edge of the gauze onto the table. The sound of Goliath breathing beneath both their feet. Heavy, steady, content, Barrett said, his voice ordinary, as if he were talking about the weather or the price of gas. That doctor moved cities. Voluntarily. Margot stopped wiping. Looked up. Voluntarily? Barrett looked at her. 1 second. He wouldn't sit still. But he sits still now. Margot looked into his eyes. Gray, even. Unblinking. She looked at his hand on the table. Bruised purple. Swollen. She looked at the torn leather jacket at his shoulder. She didn't ask what he wouldn't sit still meant. She didn't ask where the bruises came from. She didn't ask why the shoulder was torn. She understood enough. And she chose not to ask. The same way Barrett chose not to tell. She lowered her head and continued cleaning the bruises, laid fresh gauze over them, and wrapped his hand lightly. Her hands were steady, not trembling, each layer of gauze even, tight enough to hold but not to squeeze. Done. She let go of his hand, sat upright. The two of them sat across from each other at the dining table, the bowl of warm water between them, the used gauze folded neatly beside it, Goliath lying under both their feet, his head resting on Barrett's foot, his tail resting on Margot's. Barrett looked at her. "You're not asking me what I did." Margot looked at him. "You're not asking me why I had the bandages ready." Silence. Long, but not heavy. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was light. Light in the way only 2 people who truly understood each other could make it. Barrett nodded. Slightly. Almost too small to see. His chin lowered less than a centimeter, then rose again. Without careful attention, someone would have missed it. But Margot watched carefully. 3 years of reading patients' expressions had taught her to watch carefully, and 2 weeks living beside Barrett Holt had taught her to understand what he said through movements other people didn't see. That nod didn't say, "Thank you." It didn't say, "I trust you." It said something larger than both of those things combined. It said, "You're here, and I don't need to explain why." Margot understood. She stood, gathered the tools from the table, poured out the bowl of water, and washed her hands. Then she took the covered plate of food from the stove and set it in front of Barrett, the portion she had saved for him from dinner. Stew, still warm. Barrett looked at the plate, looked at her. Then he picked up the spoon and ate. The next morning, Barrett said nothing. He came down the stairs, passed through the kitchen where Margot was washing cups, stopped at the kitchen doorway, and signaled with his head. One slight lift toward the back door. "Follow me." Margot set the cup down in the sink, dried her hands, and followed him. Goliath had already run ahead. The dog still limped slightly on his right front leg. The stitches had healed but left a thick scar beneath the gray fur, and he ran across the concrete yard on 3.5 legs, with a kind of excitement Margot had never seen in him before. He knew where they were going. Barrett led Margot across the main warehouse yard, past the parking area, past the stacked containers, to the back of the warehouse grounds. A small warehouse stood there, separate from the others, close to the rear fence. Margot had seen it before from the kitchen window. but she had never gone near it. It had always been closed, locked tight, looking abandoned. But this morning, it was different. The steel door had been repainted. A fresh coat of gray, not entirely dry yet, shining beneath the morning light. A new lock, bright steel, without a single scratch. Barrett stopped in front of the door. He took a key from his jacket pocket, unlocked it, and slid the steel door aside. The door moved smoothly along the track, without the screech every other door in this warehouse made. Someone had oiled the rail. Inside, the ceiling lights came on when Barrett flipped the switch on the wall. Margot stepped in. The concrete floor had been swept clean. Not a streak of dust, not a stain of oil. In the center of the room was a large wooden table, its surface flat, its legs solid. The kind of table someone had sanded smooth, so no splinters remained. The ceiling light was bright enough. Not the murky yellow light in the main warehouse, but white light, bright enough to work under. And on the table sat 3 cardboard boxes, sealed, unopened. Margot looked at Barrett. He was leaning against the doorframe, arms folded over his chest, his right hand still wrapped in gauze from the night before. His face was cold as always. No expression, no smile, no explanation. Margot walked to the table and opened the first cardboard box. Medical cotton, large packs, 3 of them. Sterile gauze, 2 boxes. Antiseptic, 4 bottles. The liter kind, not the little bottles she had been using. She opened the second box. Oral antibiotics, 3 boxes. Painkillers, 2 boxes. Fever medicine, anti-inflammatory medicine, medical tape, suture needles, 3 packs. Proper curved surgical needles. Suture thread, 5 rolls. A new surgical clamp, tight at the joint, bright steel. She opened the third box. A blood pressure cuff, the hand pump kind, not electronic. Old, but the gauge still accurate. A stethoscope. A mercury thermometer. A complete suturing kit rolled inside a cloth pouch, the kind she had used at St. Albans Hospital. Margot stood in front of the 3 open boxes, looking down. Her hand rested on the edge of the third box, her fingers touching the cloth roll that held the suturing kit. Her fingers trembled. Not from pain, not from weakness. Her fingers trembled because she was looking down at something that, in all 27 years of her life, no one had ever given her. Not medicine, not tools. A place for her to work. A place where someone had swept the floor, painted the door, oiled the rail, installed bright lights, set up a table, and placed 3 boxes of medical supplies on top of it for her, not to send her away, not to arrange her life in another city, but to keep her here and give her somewhere to do the only thing she knew how to do. Barrett spoke from the doorway, his voice even. The floor needs covering. The walls need whitewash. There's no exam bed yet. Margot didn't turn around. She was afraid that if she turned to look at him right now, her eyes would be wet, and she didn't want her eyes wet in front of Barrett Holt. "Who paid for the medicine?" she asked, her voice calm, controlled, though her fingers still trembled on the edge of the cardboard box. "I have sources." "Legal? Do you want to treat people, or do you want to check receipts?" Margot bit her lip. She bit down hard because if she didn't, she would laugh. And if she laughed, her ribs would hurt. And if her ribs hurt, her eyes would get wet, and that circle wouldn't stop. Goliath squeezed into the small warehouse through the gap beside Barrett. The 70-kilo dog pushed past his legs, walked straight into the middle of the room, sniffed each cardboard box, sniffed the table, sniffed the floor, sniffed the walls. Then he flopped down in the middle of the concrete floor, right in the path from the door to the table. All 70 kilos of him spread out, blocking the whole way, and closed his eyes. "Your first patient is blocking the door," Barrett said. Margot looked at the dog, looked at the clean little warehouse, the bright lights, the 3 boxes of medicine on the table, looked at Barrett standing in the doorway, his leather jacket torn at the shoulder, his hand wrapped in gauze, his face as cold as every other day. But his eyes weren't. For the first time since the night he pulled her out of the dark alley, his eyes weren't cold, not warm, just open. Open the way the door to her room had never been locked again after the second day. The way his dog lay at her feet and he didn't call him back. The way the refrigerator had fresh food every morning and no one said a word. Margot took off her coat, draped it over the back of the chair, and rolled up her sleeves. She began taking medicine from the cardboard boxes and arranging it on the metal shelf mounted to the wall. 1 bottle, 1 box. One roll of gauze. Steady. Barrett watched for one more second. Then he turned and walked out. He didn't tell her to stay. He didn't say he wanted her to stay. He only turned his back and stepped into the morning light. And that was how Barrett Holt said everything he didn't know how to say with words. Goliath didn't follow him. The dog lay in the middle of the warehouse floor beside Margot. Eyes closed. Breathing evenly. Calm. He stayed. Barrett didn't call him back. He crossed the yard, his footsteps heavy on the concrete, the Ashford morning light falling across the torn shoulder of his leather jacket. Behind him, from inside the little warehouse in the back, came the sound of medicine bottles being placed on a metal shelf. Clink. Steady. Clink. Like the new heartbeat of a place that had been dead for a long time and was now coming back to life. Barrett stopped in the middle of the yard, listened. The clinking continued, even, slow, patient. He didn't turn around. He kept walking. Half an hour later, the first patient arrived, a factory worker. His broken finger wrapped carelessly in electrical tape, his face twisted with pain, his posture uncertain. Someone he knew in the South District had given him directions. Go all the way down the industrial road, turn into the warehouse gate at the end, go around back. There's a small warehouse. Find the nurse. He stood in front of the warehouse door, looked inside, and froze. In the middle of the path lay a dog the size of a calf. Wrinkled face, broad muzzle, drool shining, sprawled across the floor and blocking the entrance. The dog opened one eye and looked at him. The man stepped back, almost turned around and ran. Then, from inside the warehouse, a woman's voice carried out, calm, decisive, familiar. The voice of someone who had said this kind of sentence all her life, in emergency rooms, in dark alleys, on blood-stained wooden tables, inside a mafia warehouse, and now in a little clinic behind Ashford's Port District. He doesn't bite. Step over him. The factory worker swallowed, looked at the dog, looked at the door, and stepped over him. Goliath didn't move. He only yawned. Sometimes, the person the whole world has thrown away is the only one brave enough to stay for someone else. The worth of a human being doesn't live in appearance, doesn't live in social position, but in what they do when no one forces them to do it. Barrett found Margot in a dark alley, but in truth, she was the one who found him. If Barrett and Margot's story touched your heart, please press like and share this story with the people you love, because a good story deserves to be heard by many. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the moving stories we bring you every day. How did this story make you feel? Would you choose to stay or leave if you were in Margot's place? Share the thoughts and feelings from deep inside your heart in the comments below. We always read and always listen to every word you write. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and happiness every day. Thank you for being here with us. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.